has been quite a while since I gave a lecture. That was before I retired from the Akita International University in Japan last year. No, the year before last year. So, I'm going to give a talk and give my own reading of the situation in Hong Kong. It is by no means the only reasonable reading, and so I welcome discussions and challenges, and I stand to be corrected. So the talk will consist of 4 parts. The first one, supply and demand framework for autonomy. Now, I'm by training an economist in the Rational Expectations School, mainstream free market style, right? So this is going to be the first part. The second part, look at the concept, the traditional Chinese concept of big unity versus a possible current sentiment of separatism. Right? The third part, I'm going to draw a parallel between the Canadian experience and the experience in Taiwan. Right? And this part will throw light on the last part of the talk, which is about the case of Hong Kong. Right? And you'll find that I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this part and not so much on this part, because that would leave a lot of the discussion on the case of Hong Kong in the question and answers session afterwards. Okay. Now there are various ways of thinking about autonomy, and I'm more inclined to take a supply and demand framework. Now, starting out from a non-autonomous regime, the supply of autonomy is controlled. Think of the following: the supply of autonomy is controlled by an outside superior power who gains from less autonomy. Okay. And this is the supply side. On the demand side are the majority of the people in the polity who are willing to acquire more autonomy at some cost. Right? So on the supply side, you have an outside superior power determining how much autonomy to give. The more it gives, the less comfortable it is. Okay? On the demand side are people in the polity who would want more autonomy at some cost. Right? Now, when supply exceeds demand, admittedly a rare situation, the result may be anarchy, or partial anarchy, or some kind of enlightened paternalism. When demand consistently exceeds supply, unabated social strife will prevail. Right? So only when demand is matched by supply could the polity attain political equilibrium, characterized by a fair degree of stability. Right? So when supply matches demand, you have equilibrium, you have stability. Right? A standard economic approach. Right? Now, of course, the economists among you would say that, hey, that's not very accurate, because first of all, we're talking about monopoly situation. The supply side is controlled by one big power, right? And the entity, the thing being supplied is a public good. Right? So these two elements together would invalidate the use of the standard supply and demand model to analyze the situation. So my conceptualization of autonomy in a supply-demand framework is a little bit heuristic. Okay, you have to wave your hands a little bit to swallow it. Right? Now, the degree of autonomy in such an equilibrium may vary. The basic law of Hong Kong promised an equilibrium with a high degree of autonomy. Okay, so we're talking about high autonomy. The main feature of this high autonomy is the following: all except matters involving diplomacy and national security are to be strictly the internal affairs of Hong Kong, and as such, they brook absolutely no intervention from China. Okay, so that was the basic law, right? So within basic law, a high degree autonomy equilibrium is promised. Now, what we in Hong Kong observe, however, is neither a high autonomy nor an equilibrium. Numerous social movements, culminating in the 79-day-long Occupy movement of September to December 2014, and some would say even longer, during which participants blocked all traffic in 3 of the busiest commercial districts in Hong Kong, and which had to be dispersed by tear gas and riot police, attests to the existence of a serious excess demand for autonomy. Because there was an excess demand for autonomy. People want more, but the powers that be gave very little. So there was an excess demand. And the result was social strife. So the yearnings to be freed by the people of Hong Kong were not fulfilled. Promises enshrined in basic law were not kept. People are willing to pay a lot for more autonomy at the margin. Well, again, you can think of the supply and demand framework where there's excess supply. People are willing to pay a price at the margin for additional units to be good. And the price they're willing to pay is higher than the equilibrium price, right? So again, that's a parallel draw. So there is a significant excess demand for autonomy in Hong Kong. But this was not always the case. Before the 1997 switch of sovereignty, for about 52 years, counting from 1945 to the end of the Second World War, 52 years, Hong Kong society was essentially in a low autonomy equilibrium. The colonial British government allowed very limited degrees of autonomy. Okay. It was an autonomy in the sense that the colonial office in the British government couldn't quite control what the British governor did in Hong Kong. Once the governor was appointed, he had a great degree of freedom to govern as he liked. Right? So that was one aspect of the autonomy. The other aspect is, as far as local people are concerned, there was very little autonomy. Right? So the colonial British government allowed very limited degrees of autonomy, and the people wanted not much, being mostly war-scarred refugees from the mainland, too busy trying to earn a living. So not much was given, not much was wanted, and so you had a low degree autonomy equilibrium. That was before the change of handover of sovereignty in Hong Kong. Now, more than that, at least at one point, there was even an excess supply of autonomy. And I think Keith had mentioned that briefly. In 1946, in the wake of numerous former colonies worldwide coming into independence, the then colonial Hong Kong governor, Sir Mark Yi-Zheng, that was the Chinese name of the British government at that point, right? So he proposed a democratic reform to cede more power to the locals. But not only was there a dearth of interest among the common people, even the local Chinese elite was not interested. And not to mention the objections coming from Beijing. Years afterwards. The low degree autonomy equilibrium became even more stable after the mid-70s, when the colonial government successfully cleansed itself and society at large of corruption and embarked on a course of enlightened and responsible, still undemocratic rule, manned mostly by expats, British officials appointed by the colonial office or by the local governor. Now, in the run-up to 1997, especially after the witnessing of the 1989 Tiananmen massacre in Beijing, by an almost million-strong crowd gathered in the streets of Hong Kong, fear of being ruled eventually by Chinese communists of one kind or another, the demand for autonomy shot up. However, under the intense pressure from Beijing, which denounced any and all moves towards immediate increase of democratization or local rule, there arose the beginning of an excess demand for autonomy. Okay, so after the June 4th event, the fateful June 4th event, Hong Kong began to develop an excess demand for autonomy. Now, the British were partially successful in negotiating for a greater supply of autonomy, including universal suffrage and complete democratization of the political structure, to be realized after 1997. With the additional concession from Beijing of letting Hong Kongers rule Hong Kong. That was, of course, the basic law. Now, the tit for tat of those concessions was for the people of Hong Kong from all walks of life and of whatever political persuasion to lend support to the peaceful transfer of sovereignty. So in a few words, that covenant between Hong Kong and China was this. On the one hand, China promises democracy, freedom, etc. On the other hand, the people of Hong Kong would support the return of sovereignty to China. Right, so that was the covenant of exchange. And the people of Hong Kong dutifully and honestly delivered. There was hardly any voice of dissent regarding the handover of sovereignty. Everyone supported it. And the mood was a festive mood on days immediately before and after the handover. Okay. But China, the new sovereign, in the eyes of many of the people in Hong Kong, came up gravely short. Instead of allowing Hongkongers rule Hong Kong, Beijing now has its own highly interventionist representative office in Hong Kong, which essentially gives out marching orders on vital issues to the chief executive or the mayor of the city. Besides channeling huge amounts of resources into local elections to make sure that its preferred candidates firmly control the legislature, even with just a minority support from the voters. And more recently, wanton acts of kidnapping political dissidents, shanghaiing them into China to face prison sentences, further highlighted the erosion of whatever autonomy promised. These acts, of course, instilled real fear into the hearts of Hongkongers. The result, probably, is even more excess demand for autonomy. That may or may not be voiced. But worse, with so many broken promises on the part of the ruling power perceived by the public as betrayals and deceptions, many people, especially members of the Generation Y and the Millennials, are more and more drawn to an idea of autonomy bordering on, sometimes indistinguishable from, outright independence. As an attitude, if not yet in real attempts. So, an observer of the Hong Kong scene should expect more confrontations in the legislature, out on the streets, on the internet, and around university campuses. We have an unprecedented level of unmet excess demand for autonomy. So that was the summary of the situation. We can use the knowledge development to capture. So the second part, the concept of big unity. Versus the sentiments of separatism. Now, the concept of big unity under an imperial central kingdom, enforced by military force if necessary, has been around for more than 2,500 years in China. Right? Now, So there's nothing new. This is a very venerable and classical concept. And the concept was quite explicitly written down in one chapter of the Book of Documents. The Book of Documents. So it's one of the oldest classical tracts in China. One of the holy books of Confucianism, right? In at least two of the chapters of this book, which first appeared more than 2,400 years ago, references were made to an imperial political order in which the emperor presides over the empire in the middle. The book also described the oldest but still very much existing spatial model of China's imperial rule. The system is characterized by a political center, surrounded by 5 concentric rings. So it is a very simple model, which looks like this. Right in the center is the emperor's residence, the palace. Okay. So this is called. You go to Japan, you see the same term, which describes the imperial palace near the Chiyoda district. And surrounding this area are 5 concentric rings. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? So this is the emperor. Right? But this model is a name, it is called the model of the this term has a totally different meaning, right? In other situations, it means the 5 kinds of clothes that you wear on different occasions, like marriage or funeral or whatever. But no, here it means this model, right? And each of these areas surrounding the emperor in the called, right? And they have different names. The first one is called the second one is called E. Third one, I should have put it there. And this is perhaps the most easy to understand, wilderness, right? So it is the area farthest away from the center. Now, of course, in this model, just the idea is the governing power, the ruling power of the emperor decreases as it goes upward, right? So it has very strong power over this area. A little bit weaker here, and then it's just a bit weaker. So that at the very outskirt of the imperial kingdom, the empire, reason could be felt. Right? So this was the essential idea of the imperial rule. And that was in a book of documents written 2,400 years ago. Now, the other side of the coin of this concept of Wu Fu is when the emperor thinks that it has sufficient power to rule even on the outskirt firmly, it would do so. Okay. If it didn't have that kind of power, it would just, take an easy approach, live and let live. Right? But once it has the power to, it would rule very, very firmly. So that's the other side. Now this is what is happening in Hong Kong. In spite of the legal contracts established in the Basic Law, that means imperial power tradition trumps modern day concepts of legality. So this idea of imperial rule, easygoing when the emperor could not project power, and very tightly if it can. This concept of exercising power outweighs the considerations given to legalities in documents such as the Basic Law. Now, all this could be well and fine if the new sovereign of Hong Kong and its chosen mode of governance for the city were politically benign as the old colonial one immediately before the handover. Or, if not quite as benign, steadily improving. If it is only that, the people of Hong Kong would have no problem. Okay? But these turned out not to be the case, at least to a stable majority of Hong Kongers. Now, since at least as early as 2003, when Hong Kong was still under the First Coast Handover Administration, China has begun to show a disrespect of the Basic Law in trying to push through a local version of China's set of national security laws, which was stopped in its track by a 500,000 strong demonstration against its legislation. So that event in 2003 was the first manifestation of strengthening of this imperial reach from the center to the periphery, when the government felt, when the center felt that it could do so. And the case was the attempt to push through Hong Kong's legislature a set of national security laws similar to the ones in China, right? And that was known as a that Hong Kong does have the duty to pass such a law was indeed written into the Basic Law. Right? But in 1997, it was understood that that law to be clearly legislated and passed in Hong Kong would not be a priority. until there was a wide agreement in the city that it would be okay to do so, right? But before, probably well before Hong Kong people could give their consensus to such a legislature, there was an attempt to pass it. Okay, and that was in 2003. And the result was a 500,000 strong demonstration against the legislation. Okay. Now, the government backed off. The government backed off. That event was also the first watershed in Hongkongers' defiance against the center. It was an attempt by the center to control the periphery. There was also an event in which the periphery pushed up against the attempt from the center. Yet, the defiance was by and large of the nature of a loyal opposition. In the following sense, political parties representing the opposition at that point were mostly baby boomers and members of Generation X, steeped in Chinese culture and fully and unquestioningly attuned to the concept of unity. They were opposed to the communist center, but stood together with Beijing as dutiful Chinese. So that was year 2003. There was an opposition pushing back the attempted legislation, yet one can see that as the act of a loyal opposition. Now, what was really surprising was that as the Generation Y and the millennials grew up and gradually became politically sensitive, they went through a cultural identity metamorphosis. More and more of them began to think of themselves strongly as Hongkongers, while their allegiance to the Chinese identity wore off. Even while they grew up mostly under the new regime, with its own brand of political education implemented in schools and a pervasive socialization with a nationalistic slant in the wider polity. This trend has become quite apparent in numerous polls taken in the last 10 years. At first, a cultural apathy, or at most a loathing, even disdain of things coming from the communist China, this cultural rebellion of the young became much more problematic in the eyes of Beijing since the coming into power of the third and current chief executive, or mayor, Mr. C.Y. Leung. The rebellious young generation achieved prominence first in a 2012 demonstration against the government imposition of a patriotic education curriculum in elementary and secondary schools. The movement was organized by a group of high school students and supported by parents. In the end, it forced the government to retract the curriculum. Their second showing, with more organizers from university students, was a tour de force that attracted worldwide attention and was known as the Occupy or Umbrella movement. Though this time the movement failed to achieve its objective to force the government to agree to genuine democratic reforms and universal suffrage as promised in the basic law, it powerfully changed the political cultural identity of the young people. Polls after polls taken after the movement among university students showed a significant plurality of respondents in support of full autonomy or political independence of Hong Kong. And the members of Generation Y and the millennials grew up with much more direct and indirect contact between Hong Kong and China via physical contacts and the internet. They know much more about China than their parents did while growing up. At that time, when the parents were growing up, China was tightly or partially, at least partially closed. Yet it seems that more and better knowledge on the part of the younger people in Hong Kong has actually weakened their cultural affinity for their motherland. Now that is very difficult for Beijing to understand. In this metamorphosis, the young Hong Kongers have been strongly influenced by the political developments in Taiwan, where a pro-independence movement has become ever more popular, even though under fatal threats from China, the movement's goal can hardly be realized in any foreseeable future. But more and more, the term Taiwan independence, 台獨, or 台獨, anathema and political poison to be avoided at all costs by Hong Kong's baby boomers, members of Generation X, and all the parties representing them, including the anti-communist and pro-democratic ones. That concept of 台獨, Taiwanese independence, have become, among the Generation Y and millennials, have become respectable, even fashionable. And more of them are aware of the historical parallel between the Canadian experience of independence and that of the still to be fully achieved Taiwan independence. Which brings me to the third part. Now again, I'm going to create a special reading, my own reading, of the history and reality of Taiwan in the light of a comparison with the Canadian experience. Now, without pretending to know a lot about Canadian history, let me state the following briefly, and I stand to be corrected, right? Now, after the discovery of America by Columbus, European countries sent out settlers into this continent over the next several centuries. By virtue of their superior technologies and social organizational skills, not to speak of the inadvertent introduction of germs and viruses unknown to the indigenous peoples, the Europeans soon conquered much of the continent. Different colonies came into being and developed into viable proto-states that differed more and more from their motherlands. The first of these gained independence from Britain and became the United States after 7 or 8 years of very bloody warfare. Now, the colonies colonies that were to become today's Canada followed a much more gradual and less violent process, progressively achieving independence from Britain and France in successive stages in 1867, 1931, and finally 1982. Now the salient points I take away from this simple, even simplistic version account of Canadian history are the following. First, it was a colony built by an advanced civilization when it imposed itself on a less advanced one, decimating almost completely the latter in the process. And secondly, the colony then turned around and became independent. In the case of Canada, essentially peaceful. Now the story of Taiwan is almost the same, except that it still has to reach political consummation. So let me draw the parallels more clearly. The Han people from China, Hanzu, the Han people from China first came to Taiwan in sustainable numbers a little bit more than 400 years ago, at a time when Europe was also beginning to embark on its historic voyages of discovery and colonization. So the age of discovery in Europe, in Western Europe, coincided with the first wave of immigrants of Han Chinese to Taiwan. 400, more than 400 years ago, right? At the end of the Ming Dynasty. Now, at first, they were mostly the Fujianese people, Fujian, themselves descendants of branches of the original northern Han people who had colonized the southern non-Han people. Right? So let me say this is China. Fujian is the province here. Yizheng is the province, right across Taiwan. Right? So the first wave of Han Chinese came from this area. They settled and occupied the coastal areas on land that they took from the native peoples. So that was the first wave. The next wave of Han settlers to come across the strait were the Hakka people, 客家人. So this was the second wave. And they came about 300 years ago. And the Hakka people were themselves latecomers to southern China from the north. These second wave settlers of Taiwan went further inland. Of course, the coastal areas are the most valuable areas, right? Everyone wants to live on the coast and sea view with seaports and catch fish and so on and so forth, right? And rivers flowing from the mountains to the sea would create deltas, a fertile land on the coastal area. So coastal land were first taken up by the first wave of Han settlers in Taiwan. And the second wave of Han settlers, the Hakka people, had to make do with going a little bit inland. Now, in that process, they drove the native peoples further and further inland, up the foothills, and eventually up the mountains. Okay? So that in modern times, you have this term called the high mountain people in Taiwan. 高山族, 高山族. Okay? They were not mountain people before. No one would be so stupid as to live on the top of the mountain, right? They were driven up there, they were pushed up, right? Those few who remained in the flatlands, natives, were called, obviously, flatlanders. Okay? So you have this term in Taiwan as well. So you have now, through carnages and other means, through killing off and other means, the number of native peoples dwindled. Now, of course, that is a familiar story, right? We know something about the colonial experience of North America. Today, there are a mere 2% of Taiwan people, or 500,000 out of a total of 25 million, who declare themselves as belonging to one of the several dozen recognized native peoples of Taiwan. Although if one counts in the various degrees of blood mixing, the percentage could be as high as 85%, according to one anthropological study done by a noted Taiwan hematologist, Yizheng, using advanced modern techniques. Right? So you see these Han people coming over, taking over the land of the native people, and sorry to say, cutting some of them off, and so that part of Taiwan was essentially similar to what happened in America. Okay. An advanced civilization imposing itself on a less advanced civilization. Right? And that also happened about 400 years ago. Now, the interesting question is, who are the native peoples of Taiwan here? Okay. The question was first studied about 100 years ago by anthropologists. Many of them in the beginning were Japanese. Okay. We know that Japan colonized Taiwan in the year 1905, right? And we first started studying the peoples of Taiwan on a scientific, academic basis, right? So these anthropologists gradually came to some quite amazing conclusions. It turns out that they are part of a group of people collectively known in anthropology as the Austronesians. Austronesians, Aus is in Australia. So this means Southern Islanders. Now, the amazing thing is these Austronesians together populate most of the islands in the Pacific Ocean. These people, the Austronesians, occupies the most expansive geographic area among the peoples of the world. And the Austronesian family of languages comprise the group with the largest number of distinct but related sub-languages. Their distinctness as a diverse but related ethnic group has been well established by numerous DNA and other studies. So, the native peoples of Taiwan, right, belong to the Austronesian race. And the Austronesians populate a vast area over the Pacific Rim. But where did these people all come from? Okay. Was there a unified origin? In the 1980s, Australian and American anthropologists proposed what has become a front-running theory pointing to a unique origin of the Austronesians, and that origin was Taiwan. Right? Taiwan. The story of the Austronesian diaspora began about 12,000 years ago, when the first group of seafarers made their way from Taiwan into the vast oceans, first reaching the Philippines, the Malayan Peninsula, the Okinawa group, then the micro, macro, and Polynesian island groups, including places as far away as Madagascar, Hawaii, the Easter Islands, the Galapagos, and finally, about 1,200 to 800 years ago, New Zealand. So, the Yi people, Yi-Zheng, of Taiwan today, and the Maori people of New Zealand are blood relatives. Right? You look at them, their facial features, their clothing designs, the sculpture on their boats, canoes, they all share the same flavor. Right? But there was, in fact, an even older prehistory to that diaspora. For on a quasi-geological scale, even the Taiwan natives were not natives, but were descendants of a race that populated what today is southwest China and northern Indochina. So you have a diaspora of natives coming out from Taiwan according to this theory, which has been quite well tested. And these people, originating from Taiwan, in turn had their origin in this area of the world. Okay? Southwest China and northern Indochina Peninsula. Okay? So, like that. Now, the race that sent out a branch of their people, which eventually reached Taiwan, this race was well documented in ancient Chinese history books. Okay? They had this name. They were called the 100 Viets. Viet as in Vietnam. Right? 100 Viets. That's his name in history books. In more modern anthropology books, they were known as the A branch of them made their way to today's Fujian province and nearby coastal areas. And then, just before the end of the last glacial period of the last ice age, which was about 15,000 years ago, it went to Taiwan. Right? So, write down the years. So about 15,000 years ago, you have this movement. And they settled in Taiwan. And then 3,000 years later, they began the diaspora and spread all over the Pacific Rim. Right. Even to Indonesia. Now, those were times well before the appearance of the Han Chinese civilization, which came into existence a mere 5,000 years ago. Right? So when these movements first started, there was no China, no Chinese civilization, right? Which came way, way after. So it would be wrong to say that the Taiwan natives were originally Chinese, right? That would be a totally wrong concept. If people say so, that would be ethnic chauvinism writ large. Now, if I have time, I can tell you even more interesting details about what the anthropologists found out. But one interesting bit of evidence that I want to share with you was the following. You know, people, anthropologists, scientists, were trying to crack some puzzles. And one of the puzzles was, if you say that all these people belong to the same racial group, right? You have the DNA test, you have the cultural clothing test, facial feature test, whatever. But one thing stood out, and that was among all the languages of the Austronesians, linguists noticed that each one of them contains a very rich maritime vocabulary. Which is not surprising, right? These are islanders. So in their speech, they have to refer to the ocean, the sea, maritime weather, navigational skills, techniques, things like that, how to build a ship, things like that. Very rich maritime vocabulary among all the Austronesian languages, except the languages found in Taiwan. They do not contain any significant maritime vocabulary. Okay, so that was a puzzle that people tried, that scientists tried to figure out. Eventually, they came up with this theory. Now, the journey began 15,000 years ago in Taiwan, right? Now, that was also around the time when the last glacial period of the last ice age ended. Right? And this theory says, when the branch of the old ancient Viets made their way to Taiwan, Taiwan and the mainland were connected by terra firma, dry land. It was because of the melting of the ice at the poles at the end of the last glacial period of the last ice age, when the Earth started to warm up, that the ocean level rose, and this land here became submerged. But that was after these people had crossed over, right? So when they made their way to Taiwan, they were walking. They walked all the way, and there was no need for them to develop a maritime vocabulary. Okay? But once they started to make their way to the islands across the oceans, they had to do so. Right? So that's a very, very neat discovery. Now, all these interesting anecdotes serve to illustrate one point. About 400 to 500 years ago, when large-scale Han migration to Taiwan began, Taiwan was much like the Canada of that age, a land of strange natives who were soon to meet their fate in the hands of an advanced civilization. In other words, Taiwan became a Han Chinese colony, much as Canada did with the British. But then, of course, Taiwan had a much worse fate. Since then, Taiwan went through a succession of partial or complete colonial rules, beginning with the Spanish and Dutch. Okay. Now, although the Han people went there even ahead of the Spanish and Dutch, they did not establish a viable government there. The first foreign government introduced in Taiwan were Spanish and Dutch. Okay. But they ruled only over parts of the island. And afterwards, they were defeated by the Han and Manchurian Chinese. And then the Japanese. And then Han Chinese again, after the Second World War. Under Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Kuomintang, KMT, the party who just lost the general election to the pro-independence opposition 2 weeks ago. So altogether, Taiwan went through several colonial rules. The first one was Spanish-Dutch. The second one was Japanese. Third one was second one was Chinese-Manchurian. Okay? Third one was Japanese. Fourth one was again Chinese. Okay? So you can understand that many of the people in Taiwan say no more. We don't want another wave of colonial soldiers from across the strait. Okay. Now, the current Taiwan independence movement, spearheaded mostly by the descendants of the original waves of Han immigrants who went over to Taiwan at the end of the Ming Dynasty, just more than 400 years ago. They are joined by a more diverse group of young people. They have long since abandoned the Han-Chinese concept of big unity. In fact, if the descendants of the British could build an independent, prosperous nation of Canada and remain friendly with their mother country, why can't the Taiwanese do the same with the Chinese? Right? So that's the question they're asking, right? passport of my book. Hong Kong. Today, a separatist sentiment is fermenting in the city. Most Hong Kong people are Southern Chinese people, descendants of Han colonists and people exiled from Central China. And these people came southwards in conquests that began in the Qing and Han dynasties, right? So now we're not talking about Taiwan anymore. We're talking about Southern China, this part, right? That is bearing on Hong Kong. So most Hong Kongers are Southern Chinese people, right? And these Southern Chinese, Han Chinese people migrated from the north about 2,000 years ago, starting with the Qing and Han dynasty, Chong Han. Right? Now they came as colonists, conquistador, right? Those conquests were large-scale, bloody events, well documented in ancient official Chinese history books. All right? So the conquest of southern China by northern Han Chinese was bloody as hell. Now, as a southerner, a southern Han, right? My ancestors had blood on their hands. What can we do? I mean, this is history, right? But we have to face it honestly. Now, the language spoken by Hong Kong people differs radically from the northern language of Mandarin. Not only because of its evolution throughout 2,000 years, okay, with local changes and adaptations, it also has a distinct ancient Viet substratum of words, phrases, pronunciations, and tones not found in the northern languages, especially Putonghua, as Mandarin is known and taught in your local Confucius Institute. I'm sorry, my reading of history points to this. We Han Chinese are descendants of great and cruel colonists, members of an imperial and imperialistic empire. Now, Hong Kong was ceded to the British in 1842 and briefly occupied by the Japanese during the Second World War and handed over back to China in 1997. In addition to the long-time local Han people who had been there for many generations, the so-called Cantonese and Hakka people, there are several waves of more recent immigrants. The first such wave came to Hong Kong during the period of Japanese aggression on mainland China, when the Chinese came here as refugees searching for a safe haven. Now, when the war ended, some of them went back to China, and some stayed behind, including the famous Mr. Li Ka-shing. So, then came the second wave of immigrants who fled the communists in 1949, which essentially doubled the population. They were joined by a steady trickle of mostly illegal immigrants who fled to Hong Kong via land and water routes throughout the next 50 years, especially during periods of political upheaval and economic disasters in China under communist rule. Now, It is the descendants of these waves of immigrants from China that forms the younger generations from which the core of the rebellious spirit came from. Now, the actual story is more complex than that. In early 2012, a few months before Beijing anointed Mr. Yi-Zheng to become Hong Kong's mayor, he was popular, more popular than the number of electoral votes that he obtained from the 1,200 electors. He was in fact popular. This was because Mr. Leung, with a lower middle class background and a very good professional track record as a land surveyor, talked the language of social reforms and Keynesian transfer programs. So even the social workers supported him. The students loved him. His opponent came from a tycoon family and was considered aloof, detached from reality, a member of the old wealth. Now, a post done at that point, just before his anointment to become the mayor of Hong Kong, polls showed that he had the support of more than 70% of university-age citizens. Okay. Today, the same percentage in that age group is against him. A mere 4 years difference. In terms of overall cultural and national identities, Hong Kongers went through major long-term changes. At the 1997 establishment of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government, skepticism of China's intentions and reliability of her promises of high degree of autonomy was strong. Those who considered themselves to be Chinese consisted of a 40% minority. Now, there was a figure of 4%, right, in 1982. So there was a big improvement in 1997, but still less than one half of the people in Hong Kong at that point considered themselves Chinese. Right? With the relatively liberal rule during the first 10 years of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government, that percentage gradually increased to about 60% in 2008. Now that was a majority, right? So finally, a majority of the people in Hong Kong considered themselves Chinese. That was in year 2008. Again, that's a very memorable year for Hong Kong people. One recalls that in that year, 2008, an especially auspicious year for China, the country staged and did extremely well in the highly successful Beijing Olympics. Right? And its cosmonauts successfully broke the country's records in its space endeavors. They visited Hong Kong as national heroes to rave welcome. Now that was further helped by the apparent robustness of the Chinese economy when the entire Western world went into economic chaos following the subprime crisis. Okay. So nationalism, Chinese Han nationalism in Hong Kong reached its climax in the year 2008 and immediately after. But the course changed quite abruptly after 2008, and the aversion of Hong Kong people towards the Chinese national identity took on a sharp and steady decline. At last count, done last December by the same pollster, polling agency in Hong Kong, the percentage of Hong Kongers who would consider themselves Chinese was back to the low 40s, same as in the year 1997, before the handover, right? Now the catalyst of this downtrend was guess what? The imprisonment of Nobel Peace Prize laureate Mr. Liu Xiaobo. Which was followed by the apparent hanging death of June 4th activist Li Wangyao, who was found hung, dead in his apartment. Right? Plus numerous similar incidents. Okay? All these news reached Hong Kong very quickly. And so the number of the figures plummeted. The latest kidnapping of banner books publishers in Hong Kong certainly does not help. Now, it is against such a social-political background that a localist separatist sentiment began to grow in Hong Kong about 3 years ago, coinciding with the coming into power of Mr. C.Y. Leung, who has governed with a theme of fusing Hong Kong with the motherland. Okay? Fusing Hong Kong with the motherland. Just when the people of Hong Kong are trying to pull themselves apart from the motherland, this person, this governor, is trying to fuse the two, right? So political activists and groups embodying this separatist sentiment mushroomed during the Occupy movement of 2014. Some of them fielded candidates and even won seats in the district council elections last November. Now, some of these groups also took on a militant character as they embraced a strategy of proactive dissent. The refusal of the government to prosecute 7 policemen who brutally and illegally beat up an Occupy movement participant added fuel to this militancy, a fact highlighted by the most recent episode of the fishbowl revolution that occurred Monday night this week, in which young rebels attacked fully armed police who tried to outlaw some street hawkers selling their merchandise to a Chinese New Year crowd. Now, the more radical elements among the separatist sentiments have announced their political goal of Hong Kong independence publicly. Now, of course, the independence concept in Hong Kong has been considered far-fetched and totally unrealistic, given an ironclad government with a strong police at its disposal, supplemented by the presence of the People's Liberation Army soldiers stationed in half a dozen barracks throughout Hong Kong. The fledgling independence movement is taking inspiration and tactical cues from that in Taiwan, even though the latter is already battle-tested, much more experienced, infinitely more resourceful, and hard to imitate. Going forward, we expect more frequent and severe confrontations. Beijing and the Leung government in Hong Kong will take a hard line, but the separatists, who did not seem to be cowed, will likely not budge. If that is the case, the next climax could well create a martyr for the separatists. And the movement would then begin, much like the February 28th incident of 1947 in Taiwan, which became an icon and rallying cry of the independence movement there for the next 70 years. If that comes to pass, then China would have successfully created for herself a ring of independence movements on all quarters on its periphery, starting with Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. None of these movements are likely to succeed anytime soon, of course, but all of them are to be problematic for China. Beijing, as a rule, lays the blame on foreign instigators and domestic traitors. It never gives a thought to the possibility that its own high-handed policy may have been the main culprit. That certainly is not going to work. Right? So this is my talk. And if you have time, feel free to stay behind and discuss. Right?